Imagine this. You're driving home from work on a Tuesday evening, thinking about dinner plans and tomorrow's meeting. The radio plays softly in the background. Your phone buzzes with a text from your spouse. Life feels ordinary, predictable, safe. Then, in the span of a single heartbeat, everything you thought you knew about yourself, about courage, about what really matters, gets thrown out the window. This is the story of Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old accountant from Portland, Oregon, whose split-second decision during a catastrophic bridge collapse would save 17 lives and change her forever.
It's about those crucial moments when ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things, when fear and heroism dance together in a terrifying waltz that lasts exactly 1.3 seconds. But here's what makes Sarah's story different from the headlines you scroll past every day.
It's not just about the moment of crisis.
It's about what happens before that moment, the tiny choices and circumstances that aligned like dominoes, and what happens after, when the cameras stop rolling and real life begins again. Because the truth about heroism isn't what you think it is, and neither is the cost. Sarah Chen had always been the kind of person who checked her mirrors twice before changing lanes, who kept emergency kits in both her car and apartment, who read product reviews for 20 minutes before buying a coffee maker. Her friends called it being careful. Her ex-husband had called it being neurotic. Sarah preferred to think of it as being prepared. On the morning of October 15, 2024, she followed her usual routine with the precision of a Swiss watch. Coffee at 6:45 a.m. Black with 1 sugar cube. Local news while eating steel-cut oats with blueberries. Weather check through the window, not the app, because she trusted her eyes more than algorithms. The sky hung gray and heavy over Portland, pregnant with rain that hadn't yet decided to fall. Sarah worked as a senior accountant at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized firm downtown that specialized in nonprofit organizations. She'd been there 8 years, long enough to have her own parking spot and to know exactly which elevator moved fastest during rush hour. Long enough to feel invisible in the way that steady employees often do. The drive to work took her across the Riverside Bridge, a sturdy steel structure that had spanned the Willamette River since 1962. She'd crossed it thousands of times, probably tens of thousands. It was just part of the landscape, as reliable and unremarkable as breathing. The bridge carried 4 lanes of traffic and a pedestrian walkway, supported by massive concrete pillars that had weathered decades of Pacific Northwest storms without complaint. That Tuesday started like any other. Sarah's first meeting wasn't until 10, so she had time to organize her desk and review the Morrison Foundation's quarterly reports. The foundation provided college scholarships to first-generation students, and their books were always immaculate. Working with them reminded her why she'd chosen this profession. There was something deeply satisfying about making numbers tell stories that mattered. Around 11:30, her colleague Marcus poked his head into her office. Marcus was 26, enthusiastic about everything from craft beer to cryptocurrency, and possessed the kind of relentless optimism that should have been annoying but somehow wasn't. "Sarah, you heading to lunch soon? There's this new Vietnamese place on Hawthorne that's supposed to be amazing. My cousin said their pho is like having a warm hug in a bowl." Sarah looked at her computer screen where spreadsheet cells marched in neat columns across the monitor. "I brought lunch today. Leftover pasta salad." "Come on," Marcus said, leaning against her doorframe. "When's the last time you did something spontaneous? Something that wasn't scheduled in your planner?" The question stung a little because it was fair. Sarah's life had become a series of carefully planned sequences, each day flowing predictably into the next. Since her divorce 2 years ago, she'd retreated into routines that felt safe and manageable. Spontaneity belonged to her old life, the one that had ended when she found those text messages on David's phone. "Maybe tomorrow," she said, turning back to her screen. Marcus shrugged good-naturedly. Standing offer. The Vietnamese place isn't going anywhere. But as it turned out, some things were. The afternoon progressed normally until around 4 o'clock when Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister Jennifer's name, which was unusual. Jen lived in Seattle and rarely called during work hours. "Sarah? Oh, good. I caught you." Jennifer's voice carried that particular tension that meant family drama was brewing. "I need to ask you something about Mom." Their mother, Helen Chen, was 73 and still lived independently in the house where they'd grown up in Beaverton. Lately, though, there had been signs. Forgetting appointments, getting confused about familiar routes, repeating stories from earlier in the same conversation. Jennifer, as the eldest, had appointed herself the family's chief worrier. "She called me 3 times yesterday asking about Dad's Social Security," Jennifer continued. "The same question, 3 different times. the public is carrying. And when I mentioned it to her today, she didn't remember calling at all. Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She'd noticed things too, but had been hoping they were just normal aging, the kind of minor forgetfulness that happened to everyone eventually. What are you thinking? I think we need to have the conversation
About getting her evaluated, maybe looking into senior communities. I know it's hard, but we can't pretend this isn't happening.
They talked for another 10 minutes, making tentative plans to visit their mother together the following weekend. When Sarah hung up, the afternoon light seemed grayer somehow. Change was coming whether she wanted it or not, the kind of change that couldn't be organized into neat spreadsheet columns. At 5:15, Sarah saved her work and shut down her computer. The Morrison Foundation reports could wait until tomorrow. She gathered her things with the methodical care that characterized everything she did. Laptop in its padded case, water bottle rinsed and capped, desk cleared of any stray papers. The elevator down to the parking garage was crowded with other office workers, all of them carrying the quiet fatigue that accumulated during ordinary workdays. Sarah recognized most of their faces, but knew few of their names. They were like her, people who showed up, did their jobs competently, and went home to lives that others might consider unremarkable but which felt full enough to them. Her car, a silver Honda Civic she'd bought used 3 years ago, started immediately despite the damp weather. Sarah had learned to appreciate reliability over excitement. The car was paid off, fuel efficient, and had never left her stranded. It wasn't the sporty convertible she'd dreamed of in college, but it was hers, and that mattered more than she'd expected it would. The route home took her north through downtown Portland, then across the Riverside Bridge toward the residential neighborhood where she rented a small but tidy apartment. Traffic moved steadily but not quickly, the typical Tuesday evening pace of people heading home to dinner and television, and the small domestic rituals that knit ordinary lives together. As Sarah merged onto the bridge approach, she noticed a construction crew working on the southbound side. Orange cones and yellow vests, the familiar dance of urban maintenance that happens so constantly it became background noise. She'd seen similar crews dozens of times, replacing expansion joints or repairing concrete that had been worn smooth by decades of traffic. The radio played soft rock from the 90s, songs she remembered from high school and college when everything had seemed possible and the future stretched ahead like an unmarked highway. Alanis Morissette sang about irony while Sarah checked her mirrors and maintained a safe following distance behind a blue pickup truck whose driver seemed to be texting. At exactly 5:43 p.m., Sarah was approximately 30 feet past the midpoint of the Riverside Bridge when she felt something that shouldn't have been possible. The road beneath her car shifted. Not the gentle sway that suspension bridges sometimes exhibited in strong wind, but something deeper and more ominous, like the earth itself was reconsidering its commitment to staying put. She looked in her rearview mirror and saw something that made no sense. The section of bridge she'd just crossed was no longer level. Instead, it tilted at an impossible angle, and cars that had been following her were sliding backward toward the river 60 feet below. The rational part of her brain, the part that balanced budgets and followed traffic laws and always used turn signals, insisted this couldn't be happening. Bridges didn't collapse, not modern ones, not without warning. But the evidence was right there in her mirror, undeniable and terrifying. The blue pickup truck ahead of her continued forward, its driver apparently unaware that behind them, the world was coming apart. But Sarah knew. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that she was witnessing something that would define the rest of her life. Time didn't slow down the way it did in movies. If anything, it accelerated thoughts and observations crowding together in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She saw the school bus in her peripheral vision, bright yellow and full of children heading home from late activities. She saw the cement truck that had just entered the bridge from the opposite direction. She saw the young mother pushing a stroller on the pedestrian walkway, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet was no longer trustworthy. And in that impossible moment, as the Riverside Bridge began its catastrophic failure, Sarah Chen faced a choice that would echo through countless lives. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her foot hovered between the brake and accelerator, and somewhere in the analytical mind that had spent 8 years organizing other people's financial futures, a calculation began. Not a calculation about profit and loss or risk and return, but about something far more fundamental. What we owe to strangers, and what we're willing to sacrifice for people whose names we'll never know. The bridge groaned beneath her, the sound of metal and concrete surrendering to forces they were never designed to withstand. And Sarah Chen, who had spent 2 years playing it safe, who checked her mirrors twice and always kept emergency kits close at hand, made a decision that had nothing to do with being careful and everything to do with being human.
The human brain, Sarah would later learn, processes information differently during extreme crisis.
Normal thoughts that might take several seconds to form and consider instead flash through consciousness in milliseconds, like lightning illuminating a landscape that was always there, but never seen so clearly. In the priest.
3 seconds that followed her realization that the Riverside Bridge was collapsing, Sarah's mind performed calculations that would have taken engineers hours to compute. She assessed the angle of the failing section, the speed of the vehicles around her, the trajectory of the school bus that was still moving forward, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding behind it. But first, she had to understand what was actually happening. The Riverside Bridge had been showing signs of structural stress for months, though no one in the city's transportation department had recognized them for what they were. Small cracks in critical support beams had been growing incrementally, weakened by a combination of age, increased traffic loads, and a particularly harsh winter that had subjected the steel to repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The construction crew that Sarah had noticed wasn't performing routine maintenance. They were there because someone had finally spotted hairline fractures in one of the primary supports. They were 12 hours too late. The failure began in the southern support structure, where decades of accumulated stress found its weakest point. When steel fails catastrophically, it doesn't bend gracefully like in slow-motion demonstrations. It snaps with violent suddenness, transferring enormous loads to other structural elements that were never designed to bear them alone. The first thing Sarah heard was a sound like thunder, but deeper and more prolonged. The second thing she noticed was that her car was no longer moving in a straight line. The roadway itself was shifting, concrete deck plates grinding against each other as the underlying steel framework bent beyond its design limits. Behind her, a chain reaction was already in motion. A section of bridge where she'd been just moments before tilted sharply downward, its surface suddenly angled like a ski slope toward the dark water of the Willamette River below. Cars that had been maintaining highway speeds found themselves sliding backward despite their drivers' desperate attempts to brake or steer. A white sedan spun sideways as its tires lost grip on the tilted pavement. The driver, a woman about Sarah's age, had just enough time to look up through her windshield with an expression of complete bewilderment before her car began its descent toward the river. In the passenger seat, someone who might have been her teenage daughter was screaming, though the sound was lost in the greater cacophony of failing infrastructure and human panic. The cement truck that had just entered the bridge from the north was now accelerating uncontrollably as the roadway dropped away beneath it. Its driver, a man named Roberto Vasquez who had been delivering concrete to construction sites for 15 years, fought to maintain control as 60,000 pounds of truck and liquid concrete began to slide backward toward the growing gap in the bridge deck. On the pedestrian walkway, the young mother Sarah had noticed was now running, pushing her stroller ahead of her as fast as she could manage. The walkway was attached to the same failing support structure as the roadway, and it too was beginning to tilt. But she was closer to the northern end of the bridge, closer to safety, if she could reach it in time. The school bus represented the most complex part of Sarah's instantaneous calculation. It was yellow and massive and full of children, perhaps 20 or 30 kids, heading home from after-school programs or late sports practices. The bus driver, an elderly man with 40 years of experience navigating Portland's streets, had noticed something wrong and was already beginning to brake. But slowly, carefully, the way you brake a vehicle full of precious cargo. Too slowly, the physics were unforgiving. The bus had entered the bridge at approximately 35 miles per hour and weighed roughly 30,000 pounds when loaded with students. The section of roadway where it was traveling was beginning to sag as the structural failure propagated northward, but it hadn't tilted dramatically yet. The driver still had perhaps 15 seconds before the deck beneath him became unstable. But 15 seconds at highway speeds meant the difference between escape and catastrophe for everyone behind the bus. If it continued at its current pace, it would clear the bridge safely. The children would go home to their families, do homework, complain about dinner, live the unremarkable lives that children deserve to live. However, the vehicles following the bus, including the cement truck that was now sliding backward on the failing southern section, would not be so fortunate. The collapse was accelerating, the mathematical certainty of structural failure playing out in real time. Sarah saw all of this, understood all of this, in the time it took her heart to beat once. Her Honda Civic was positioned at the critical point. She was close enough to the northern end of the bridge to escape safely if she accelerated. Her car was small, nimble, and she was an experienced driver who had never been in a serious accident. If she floored the accelerator and focused solely on her own survival, she would reach solid ground with perhaps 3 seconds to spare. But she was also positioned perfectly to create a different outcome. The school bus needed to know about the danger behind it. Its driver, focused on the road ahead and managing a vehicle full of children, might not have realized the extent of the emergency unfolding in his rearview mirror. If Sarah could get his attention, could somehow communicate the urgency of the situation, he might accelerate faster and clear the bridge with time to spare. The problem was that alerting the bus driver would require her to take actions that would compromise her own escape route. She would need to pull alongside the bus, honk her horn, flash her lights, maybe even swerve slightly to catch the driver's peripheral vision. All of this would cost precious time and position her directly in the path of the failing roadway. There was also the cement truck to consider. Roberto Vasquez was fighting a losing battle against gravity and momentum, but he wasn't out of options yet. If he could somehow reverse direction, or even just slow his backward slide, he might be able to reach the northern section before the collapse progressed that far. But that would require someone to clear a path for him, to create space for a desperate maneuver that might or might not work. Sarah's hands moved on the steering wheel before her conscious mind had finished weighing the options. She jerked the wheel to the left, pulling her Honda into the lane beside the school bus. Her horn began blaring, a sharp electronic cry that cut through the deeper rumble of structural failure. Through the bus's side windows she could see the faces of children. Some were looking out with curiosity, drawn by the strange sounds and movements outside. Others seemed unaware that anything unusual was happening, absorbed in conversations or homework or the private daydreams that occupy young minds during routine trips home. One girl, perhaps 12 years old with long dark hair, looked directly at Sarah through the window.
Their eyes met, for just an instant, and in that moment, Sarah saw something that broke her heart and steeled her resolve simultaneously. The child's expression was trusting, completely confident that the adults around her would keep her safe, that the ordinary world of school buses and bridge crossings would continue to function as it always had.
Sarah leaned on her horn again, longer this time, and flashed her headlights repeatedly. She could see the bus driver now, a gray-haired man whose eyes were moving between his mirrors and the road ahead. He was beginning to understand that something was seriously wrong, but not yet grasping the full scope of the emergency. Behind them, the cement truck had managed to arrest its backward slide temporarily, but the roadway was continuing to tilt. Roberto had perhaps 10 seconds before physics overwhelmed his ability to control the massive vehicle. The girl in the bus window was still looking at Sarah, and now her expression was changing. Children have an instinct for danger that adults sometimes lose, an ability to sense when the familiar world has suddenly become unsafe. The girl's trusting smile was fading, replaced by the wide-eyed uncertainty that comes just before real fear sets in. Sarah made her final calculation. If she continued alongside the bus, matching its speed while signaling the danger, she could ensure that the driver understood the need for immediate acceleration. But this would place her directly in the collapse zone when the northern section of the bridge began to fail, which her engineering knowledge told her would happen within the next 8 to 10 seconds. If she pulled ahead of the bus and accelerated towards safety, she might survive, but the bus driver might not react quickly enough to save the children. The cement truck would almost certainly be lost, along with Roberto Vasquez, who had a wife named Maria and 2 young sons who were probably sitting down to dinner right now, expecting their father to walk through the door within the hour.
The numbers were stark and unforgiving.
Sarah could save herself, or she could save 17 strangers. But the mathematics of structural collapse and highway physics made it impossible to do both. She pressed down harder on her horn and flashed her lights one more time. Then, instead of accelerating toward the safety of solid ground, Sarah Chen did something that would haunt her dreams and define her legacy for the rest of her life. She hit her brakes. Not enough to stop completely, but enough to position her Honda Civic in exactly the right place to create a gap between the school bus and the cement truck. A gap that might give both vehicles the space they needed to execute the desperate maneuvers that could save the lives inside them. The Riverside Bridge groaned beneath her, its death throes echoing across the Willamette River like the cry of some massive wounded beast. And Sarah Chen, who had spent her entire adult life avoiding risk and playing it safe, drove deliberately into the teeth of a catastrophe that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the price of being human. What happened next unfolded with the terrible precision of a physics equation written in steel, concrete, and human flesh. Sarah's Honda Civic, now positioned between the school bus and the collapsing section of bridge, became the pivot point around which 17 lives balanced. The math was brutal in its simplicity. Every second she remained in the danger zone increased the chances of survival for the others while decreasing her own. The school bus driver, whose name was Frank Morrison and who had been safely transporting Portland's children for 23 years, finally understood what Sarah had been trying to communicate. Through his side mirror, He could see the impossible sight of the bridge deck tilting behind them like a drawbridge opening in reverse.
Cars were sliding backward toward the dark water below, their brake lights tracing red arcs through the gray afternoon air. Frank's foot found the accelerator with sudden urgency.
The big yellow bus lurched forward, its diesel engine roaring as he pushed it faster than school district regulations technically allowed. In the seats behind him, children who had been chattering about homework and weekend plans fell silent, instinctively sensing that their routine journey home had become something else entirely. "Mr. Morrison?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a seventh grader who sat in the third row and always called him by his proper name instead of just driver like most kids did.
What's happening? Frank's eyes moved between the road ahead and his mirrors, watching the catastrophe unfold behind them while trying to navigate 30,000 pounds of school bus through what might be the most important driving of his life. "Just hold on, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "We're going to be fine." But even as he spoke those words, Frank Morrison knew they might not be true. The bridge deck was failing faster now, the collapse propagating northward like a crack racing through ice. He could feel the roadway beneath his tires beginning to shift, the subtle change in angle that meant they were running out of time. Behind Sarah's Honda, Roberto Vasquez was fighting his own battle with physics and desperation. The cement truck had stopped its backward slide, but barely. Roberto had managed to engage the vehicle's differential lock and was now attempting something that violated every principle of safe truck operation he'd learned in 15 years on the job.
He was trying to drive a 60,000-pound cement truck in reverse, up an increasingly steep grade, while liquid concrete sloshed violently in the mixer barrel behind him. It should have been impossible.
Under normal circumstances, it would have been suicide. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Roberto Vasquez was not a normal man.
He was the son of Mexican immigrants who had taught him that impossible was just another word for something nobody had figured out how to do yet. He was a father whose boys were waiting for him to come home and help with their math homework. He was a husband whose wife Maria had packed him a lunch that morning and kissed his forehead and told him to drive safely. Roberto reversed the cement truck with the skill of someone who understood heavy machinery the way musicians understand their instruments. He coaxed the massive vehicle backward, inch by terrifying inch, while the bridge deck continued its slow-motion collapse beneath him. The truck's beeping backup alarm added its urgent voice to the symphony of groaning steel and human fear. Sarah could see all of this in her mirrors as she maintained her position between the bus and the truck. Her Honda was now riding on a section of bridge that was visibly sagging, the concrete deck creating gentle waves like a blanket settling onto a bed. She could feel the roadway shifting beneath her tires. The subtle wrongness that meant the infrastructure she'd trusted thousands of times was finally betraying that trust. The girl in the school bus was still watching her. Through the chaos and noise and growing certainty that she had made a decision that would cost her everything, Sarah found herself focusing on that young face. The child's expression had moved beyond confusion into something approaching understanding, not of the physics or engineering involved, but of something more fundamental. She was watching someone choose to stay behind so that others could go home. Children understand sacrifice in ways that adults sometimes forget. They see it in parents who work extra shifts to pay for school clothes, in teachers who stay late to help struggling students, in older siblings who give up their own desires so younger ones can have what they need. This child, whose name Sarah would later learn was Emma Rodriguez, recognized something familiar in the deliberate way the woman in the silver car stayed in the danger zone while the big yellow bus accelerated toward safety. Frank Morrison's calculations were proving accurate. The school bus was pulling away from the collapse zone, its heavy frame and powerful engine carrying 37 children toward solid ground in normal Tuesday evenings. Through his radio, Frank could hear the first emergency dispatches beginning to crackle across Portland's airwaves, though the responders didn't yet understand the full scope of what was happening on the Riverside Bridge. Roberto's cement truck was also making progress, backing up the tilting roadway with agonizing slowness. He had maybe 50 feet to go before reaching the stable northern section of the bridge, 50 feet that might as well have been 50 miles given the rate at which the structural failure was spreading. But it was working. Sarah's gamble was working. The space she had created by positioning her Honda between the two larger vehicles had given both drivers the room they needed to execute their desperate maneuvers. The school bus was no longer in danger of being rear-ended by the sliding cement truck. The cement truck wasn't blocked by the slower-moving bus ahead. However, Sarah's own situation was deteriorating rapidly. The section of bridge where she was positioned had now tilted to approximately 15 degrees from horizontal. Her car's tires were beginning to lose traction on the concrete surface, which was becoming slick with moisture that seemed to be weeping from the stressed infrastructure itself. She could accelerate now, could follow the school bus towards safety. The gap she had created was wide enough that she might still escape the collapse zone before it reached the critical angle where her Honda would begin sliding backward like the other vehicles behind her. But that would mean abandoning Roberto Vasquez. The cement truck was making progress, but not quickly enough. If Sarah pulled ahead now, there was a good chance Roberto's truck would lose traction before reaching stable ground.
The massive vehicle would slide backward into the growing gap where the bridge had already failed completely, taking Roberto with it into the dark waters 60 feet below. Sarah looked in her rearview mirror and saw Roberto's face through the truck's windshield.
He was perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and the concentrated expression of someone performing a task that required every ounce of skill and determination he possessed. His wedding ring caught the light as he gripped the steering wheel, and Sarah found herself wondering about the woman who had placed that ring on his finger, about the promises they had made to each other, about the life they had built together.
The choice should have been obvious. One life versus 17.
The utilitarian calculation that her accountant's mind was trained to make. But as Sarah watched Roberto fighting for his survival in her rearview mirror, the mathematics of heroism revealed themselves to be more complex than simple addition and subtraction.
Because Roberto Vasquez wasn't just one life. He was a husband whose wife would have to identify his body if he didn't make it home tonight.
He was a father whose sons would spend the rest of their lives wondering if there was something they could have done to save their daddy. He was a human being whose death would create ripples of grief and loss that would spread far beyond the cold water of the Willamette River.
Sarah made her second impossible decision. Instead of accelerating toward safety, she carefully modulated her speed to match Roberto's progress. As long as the cement truck continued moving backward up the failing bridge deck, she would maintain her position ahead of him, creating a clear path and serving as a reference point for his dangerous reverse navigation.
It was a choice that transformed her from someone trying to save others into someone willing to die with them if necessary. The bridge deck beneath her Honda continued to tilt, now approaching 20 degrees from horizontal. At this angle, most vehicles would begin to slide regardless of their driver's intentions. But Sarah's small car had better traction than the massive cement truck, and she was driving forward rather than in reverse.
She could still make it. They could still both make it.
Behind Roberto's truck, the bridge had now failed completely for a distance of approximately 200 feet. The gap was filled with twisted steel and broken concrete, some of it already splashing into the river below. Cars that had been caught in the initial collapse were gone, their passengers' fates unknown but probably unthinkable. The woman in the white sedan who had looked up through her windshield with such bewilderment was now part of Portland's history, her name destined for memorial services and newspaper articles about victims of infrastructure failure. The teenager in the passenger seat, who might have been her daughter, had become another statistic in the calculus of catastrophic engineering failure. But 37 children were racing toward safety in a yellow school bus, driven by a man who understood that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is exceed the speed limit. One cement truck operator was successfully backing his way up a collapsing bridge because a woman he'd never met had chosen to stay in harm's way to give him space to maneuver. The mathematics were working.
17 lives were moving towards safety because one person had decided that the equation of human worth couldn't be solved with simple arithmetic. Sarah's Honda crested the highest point of the bridge's arch, the car's nose angling downward toward the northern approach and solid ground. Roberto's cement truck was 20 feet behind her and still climbing. Frank Morrison's school bus was already transitioning from the bridge deck to the approach road, its young passengers unaware of how close they had come to becoming Portland's worst school transportation tragedy. They were going to make it. All of them. And then Sarah heard a sound that changed everything. The sharp crack of her Honda's rear axle giving way as the bridge deck beneath her tilted beyond the angle that any civilian vehicle was designed to handle. The sound of Sarah's rear axle snapping was sharp and final, like a gunshot echoing across the water. In an instant, her Honda Civic transformed from a vehicle into a sled, its rear wheels no longer connected to anything that could provide traction or steering control. Physics took over with merciless efficiency. The car began sliding sideways on the tilted bridge deck, its front wheels still functional, but inadequate to maintain directional control. Sarah felt the peculiar weightlessness that comes just before gravity reasserts its authority, the moment when you realize that all your careful planning and prudent decision-making mean nothing in the face of fundamental forces. Through her windshield, she could see solid ground ahead, perhaps 60 feet away. So close that under normal circumstances, she could have reached it in 3 seconds. But the Riverside Bridge was no longer offering normal circumstances to anyone. Behind her, Roberto Vasquez saw Sarah's car begin to slide,
and made an instantaneous decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing his careful backward progress towards safety, he shifted the cement truck into forward gear and accelerated towards Sarah's disabled Honda. It was an insane thing to do. The truck was pointed toward the collapsed section of bridge, toward the gap where several cars had already disappeared into the dark water below. By driving forward, Roberto was deliberately moving away from safety and toward almost certain death.
But he had seen what Sarah had done for him, had understood that she had chosen to risk her life to give him the space and time he needed to escape. Now, with her car sliding helplessly toward the growing chasm in the bridge deck, Roberto decided that some debts could only be repaid with equally impossible choices.
The cement truck's massive bumper caught Sarah's Honda just as it began to pick up speed in its slide toward disaster. The impact was carefully controlled, Roberto using his truck's weight and power to arrest the car's slide without crushing the smaller vehicle or its occupant.
For a moment, both vehicles were stationary on the failing bridge deck, locked together in an embrace that defied the laws of physics and gravity. The cement truck's engine roared as Roberto fought to maintain position, while the infrastructure continued to collapse beneath them.
Sarah looked through her rear window and saw Roberto's face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had thought, with the kind of steady determination that comes from years of handling dangerous machinery and accepting responsibility for other people's safety. Their eyes met across the space between their vehicles, and in that instant, two strangers shared an understanding that transcended language, culture, and circumstance. They were both going to die. Here, together, on a bridge that had decided to stop being a bridge.
But 37 children were safe, racing toward homes and families and ordinary Tuesday evening routines. That had to be enough.
Except it wasn't going to end that way. The school bus had reached solid ground, and Frank Morrison was already on his radio, describing the catastrophic bridge collapse to emergency dispatchers who were scrambling to mobilize every rescue resource in the Portland metro area.
Fire trucks, ambulances, Coast Guard vessels, and helicopter units were already en route, though everyone understood that for most of the people still on the failing bridge, help would arrive too late. But Frank Morrison had been driving Portland streets for 23 years, and he knew something that the emergency coordinators didn't. The northern approach to the Riverside Bridge included a maintenance access road that emergency vehicles used for bridge inspections and minor repairs. More importantly, it included a loading area where utility trucks could back up to work platforms. Frank positioned his school bus to block traffic from entering the bridge approach, then climbed out and ran toward the maintenance access gate. His key ring included a master key for Portland Department of Transportation facilities, a privilege earned through years of reliable service and careful driving. The gate opened under his key, revealing a narrow gravel road that led down toward the river level and then back up to a loading platform positioned directly beneath the northern section of the bridge.
It was designed for utility vehicles and emergency access, capable of supporting heavy equipment but not normally used for dramatic rescues. Frank keyed his radio again.
Dispatch. This is Morrison on Bus 247. I've got emergency access to the bridge loading platform.
If you can get a ladder truck here in the next 5 minutes, we might be able to reach the vehicles that are still on the intact section. The public truck assistant.
The response came back immediately. Morrison, ladder 19 is 2 minutes out on your location. Are the children safe? Children are safe and off the bus, Frank replied, watching Sarah's Honda and Roberto's cement truck through the chain-link fence that separated the access road from the bridge approach.
But there are 2 vehicles still in the danger zone, and I don't think they can get off on their own. Meanwhile, on the bridge itself, Sarah and Roberto were discovering that their situation, while desperate, might not be completely hopeless. The cement truck's weight and Roberto's skill had succeeded in stopping Sarah's slide toward the collapsed section. More importantly, the truck's powerful engine and all-wheel drive system might be capable of pushing both vehicles toward safety if Roberto could manage the most complex driving maneuver of his life.
"Can you hear me?" Roberto shouted through his open window, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the failing bridge and the roar of his truck's engine. Sarah rolled down her rear window and called back.
"Yes, my rear axle is broken. I'm going to push you," Roberto yelled. "Keep your wheels straight and don't brake unless I tell you to." It should have been impossible.
Using a cement truck to push a disabled car up a tilted bridge deck while the entire structure continued to fail required a level of precision that belonged in stunt movies, not real life. But Roberto had spent 15 years learning to handle heavy machinery in tight spaces and difficult conditions.
He understood weight distribution, traction limits, and the delicate balance between too much force and not enough. More importantly, he understood that Sarah Chen had chosen to risk her life for his, and that some gestures of gratitude could only be expressed through equally extraordinary actions. Roberto began pushing Sarah's Honda toward the northern end of the bridge with the same careful attention he had used when backing up the tilted roadway. The truck's bumper remained in contact with the car's rear end, applying steady pressure while Roberto modulated the engine's power to match the traction available from both sets of tires.
Sarah steered as best she could with only her front wheels functional, following Roberto's shouted directions while fighting the car's tendency to slide sideways on the tilted surface. Together they formed an unlikely convoy crawling towards safety at perhaps 5 miles per hour, while the Riverside Bridge continued its slow-motion collapse behind them.
The mathematics were still working against them. The bridge deck was now tilted at nearly 30 degrees, approaching the angle where even Roberto's massive truck would lose traction despite its all-wheel drive system.
They had perhaps 2 minutes before the northern section of the bridge became as unstable as the southern section had been. But Frank Morrison's emergency access was about to change those calculations completely.
Ladder 19, a massive fire truck equipped with a 100-foot hydraulic ladder, arrived at the maintenance access area just as Sarah and Roberto's improvised convoy reached the midpoint of their escape route. The fire truck's crew had been briefed on the situation during their response, and they understood that they were dealing with civilians trapped on a failing bridge rather than a standard building fire or rescue operation.
Captain Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of Portland Fire and Rescue, assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of someone who had spent 2 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The bridge loading platform was positioned approximately 40 feet below the roadway, and her ladder could easily reach the vehicles if they could get close enough to the edge. But that would require Sarah and Roberto to position their vehicles at the very edge of the failing bridge deck, in the section that was most likely to collapse completely at any moment. "Can you reach us where we are?" Sarah called down to the fire crew, hope mixing with desperation in her voice.
Captain Santos shook her head. "You need to get about 20 feet closer to the edge. Can your vehicles make it that far?"
Sarah looked at Roberto, who was still maintaining contact between his truck's bumper and her car's rear end. 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles, given the condition of the bridge deck and the limitations of her disabled Honda.
But Roberto Vasquez had not come this far to accept defeat when rescue was within sight. He revved the cement truck's engine and began pushing Sarah's car toward the edge of the collapsing bridge, toward the point where salvation and catastrophe existed separated by inches and seconds. And below them, Captain Santos extended her ladder toward 2 strangers who had chosen to risk everything for each other, proving that heroism was not a solitary act but something that multiplied when ordinary people decided that other lives were worth saving, even at the cost of their own. The rescue took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds from the moment Captain Santos extended her ladder until both Sarah and Roberto were safely on solid ground. But the experience of being lifted off a collapsing bridge while emergency vehicles surrounded the area and news helicopters circled overhead lasted much longer in their memories, stretching into a slow-motion sequence that both of them would replay thousands of times in the months and years that followed. Sarah went first, climbing carefully from her disabled Honda onto the fire department's ladder while Roberto maintained pressure with his truck to keep both vehicles stable. The transition from her car to the ladder required her to step across a gap of perhaps 18 inches, but looking down through that space, she could see the dark water of the Willamette River 60 feet below, littered with debris from the collapsed section of bridge. The climb down the ladder was surreal. With each step, Sarah could hear the bridge continuing to fail above her, the sounds of concrete cracking and steel groaning growing louder as the structural collapse spread. But she could also hear other sounds. Emergency radios crackling with updates, helicopter rotors beating the air, and most importantly, children's voices from the school bus that had reached safety.
Roberto's extraction was more complex because someone had to move his cement truck away from Sarah's car before he could abandon it. Captain Santos made the decision to have one of her crew members, a firefighter named Dave Chen who had experience with heavy equipment, drive the truck to a safer position before Roberto climbed down.
Dave Chen was no relation to Sarah, but the coincidence of names would become one of those small details that people remembered when telling the story later. As he climbed into the cab of Roberto's cement truck, Dave could see the full scope of the bridge collapse for the first time.
The southern section had failed completely, leaving a gap of nearly 300 feet where the roadway had simply disappeared. Cars, trucks, and their occupants had fallen into the river, creating a rescue challenge that would occupy emergency crews for the rest of the week.
But the northern section held long enough for Roberto to reach safety.
He climbed down the fire department ladder with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his impossible reverse drive up the collapsing bridge.
When his feet touched solid ground, Roberto Vasquez did something that surprised everyone present. He immediately asked about Sarah's condition and requested to see her. Sarah was sitting in the back of an ambulance, being examined by a paramedic who was checking for signs of shock or injury.
Physically, she was unharmed except for minor cuts from glass fragments and bruises from her seatbelt. Emotionally, she was struggling to process what had just happened and what it meant for the rest of her life. When Roberto approached the ambulance, still wearing his concrete-stained work clothes and safety vest, Sarah looked up and saw the face of someone who had chosen to risk his life for hers, just as she had risked hers for his, and 37 children she didn't know. They didn't say much at first.
What do you say to someone who saved your life by making a choice that should have killed them both? How do you thank someone for seeing your humanity clearly enough to drive toward death rather than away from it?
Your family, Sarah said finally. They must be worried. Roberto nodded.
Maria will be watching the news by now. She always worries when I'm late getting home.
You should call her.
I will. But first, Roberto hesitated, searching for words in English to express something that might not have been easily expressible in any language. What you did for the bus. For me. My boys, they're going to grow up because of what you did. Sarah felt tears starting, the delayed emotional response that often follows extreme stress. You came back for me. You could have reached safety.
We both made choices, Roberto said quietly. Good choices. The media attention began within hours.
Portland's evening news led with the story of the Riverside Bridge collapse, and by morning, national news outlets were covering what they described as a heroic rescue and miracle survival.
The footage from news helicopters showed the dramatic final moments of the bridge failure, with Sarah's Honda and Roberto's cement truck clearly visible as they were evacuated by Portland Fire and Rescue. But the cameras and reporters focused on the wrong parts of the story.
They wanted to talk about the dramatic rescue, the spectacular bridge collapse, the heroic actions of the fire department. What they missed, or chose not to emphasize, was the much quieter heroism of two strangers who had chosen to stay behind so that others could escape.
Sarah found herself uncomfortable with the media attention. Reporters kept asking her how it felt to be a hero, what had motivated her to risk her life for strangers, whether she had any regrets about her actions.
She tried to explain that she hadn't felt heroic in the moment, that she had simply seen people in danger and responded the way she hoped others would respond if she were in danger. But heroism, Sarah was learning, was not something you got to define for yourself.
Other people decided whether your actions qualified as heroic, and they did so based on their own understanding of courage, sacrifice, and moral obligation. The fact that Sarah had simply done what seemed necessary at the time was irrelevant to a public hungry for examples of extraordinary behavior in ordinary people. Roberto experienced the media attention differently. As a working-class immigrant whose primary language was Spanish, he found that reporters were less interested in his perspective and more interested in using him as a supporting character in Sarah's story.
The fact that he had made equally impossible choices, that his decision to drive forward toward the collapsed bridge had been just as courageous as Sarah's decision to position her car between the bus and truck, was often mentioned only briefly in news accounts. This bothered Sarah more than it seemed to bother Roberto.
When a newspaper reporter described Roberto as the cement truck driver who was saved by Chen's quick thinking, Sarah called the newspaper to correct the record. Roberto had saved her as much as she had saved him, she insisted. His skill and courage had been essential to both of their survivals. The funerals for the bridge collapse victims were held the following week. 14 people had died when the southern section failed, including the woman and teenager in the white sedan that Sarah had watched slide backward toward the river. The woman's name was Linda Morrison, and she was Frank Morrison's sister-in-law, returning home from a job interview when the bridge collapsed beneath her. The teenager was her daughter Katie, a high school junior who played violin in the school orchestra and had been planning to study music therapy in college. Frank Morrison spoke at both funerals, and his grief was complicated by the knowledge that his own survival, and the survival of 37 children on his bus, had been made possible by decisions that others hadn't been able to make.
The mathematics of the collapse meant that some people had been in positions where heroic choices were possible, while others had simply been in the wrong place when infrastructure failed catastrophically. Sarah attended both funerals, though she sat in the back and left quietly afterward.
She had not known Linda or Katie Morrison, but she felt connected to their deaths in ways that she couldn't easily explain.
If she had made different choices, if she had been more focused on her own survival, would the outcomes have been different?
The question was unanswerable and torturous. 3 months after the bridge collapse, Sarah received a phone call that changed her perspective on what had happened that day.
The caller was Emma Rodriguez, the 12-year-old girl who had watched Sarah through the school bus window during the collapse. Emma's mother had helped her track down Sarah's phone number because Emma had something she needed to say. When Sarah answered the phone, she heard a young voice that was nervous but determined.
"Miss Chen, this is Emma. I was on the school bus that day." Sarah remembered the girl's face immediately, the trusting expression that had transformed into something more complex as she watched Sarah make impossible choices in real time. "Emma, how are you doing?" "I'm okay. But I wanted to tell you something. I've been thinking about that day a lot, and my mom says I should talk to someone about it if I want to."
What did you want to tell me? Emma's voice was quiet but clear. "I saw what you did. I saw you choose to stay behind so we could get away. And I wanted you to know that I understand what that means."
My mom explained it to me. Sarah felt her throat tighten.
"Emma, I'm going to remember that," Emma continued. "When I grow up and have to make hard choices, I'm going to remember that sometimes the right thing to do is to help other people even when it's scary or dangerous."
You showed me that.
After Emma hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment for a long time, thinking about the ways that single decisions ripple outward through time, affecting people we never meet and shaping lives we never know about.
Emma Rodriguez was going to grow up with a different understanding of moral courage because she had witnessed it firsthand during the worst 90 seconds of her young life. That understanding would influence the choices Emma made throughout her life, the way she treated other people, the values she passed on to her own children someday. And Emma was just one of 37 children who had been on that school bus. 37 young people who now carried a lived experience of what it meant for strangers to sacrifice for each other. Roberto called Sarah every few weeks in the months following the collapse.
Their conversations were usually brief, but they served an important function for both of them. They were the only people who truly understood what had happened during those crucial moments on the bridge, the only ones who knew what it felt like to make choices that transformed them from ordinary people into something else entirely. During one of their conversations, Roberto mentioned that his older son Miguel had started asking questions about heroes and what made someone heroic. Roberto had been struggling to explain concepts like courage and sacrifice to a 10-year-old boy who lived in a world where heroism was mostly associated with superheroes and video game characters.
"I told him about you," Roberto said, "about how you stayed behind to help people you didn't even know. And then I told him about how I tried to help you because you had helped me." Miguel asked if that made us heroes.
What did you tell him? Roberto was quiet for a moment. I told him that heroes are just regular people who choose to help others even when it's hard or scary.
And that the most important thing isn't whether other people call you a hero. The most important thing is that you can look at yourself in the mirror and know that you did the right thing when it mattered.
A year after the bridge collapse, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She left her job at the accounting firm and enrolled in a graduate program in emergency management.
The woman who had spent her adult life avoiding risk and playing it safe had discovered that she was capable of extraordinary actions under pressure, and she wanted to understand how to help other people discover the same thing about themselves. Her thesis research focused on decision-making during infrastructure failures, examining how ordinary citizens respond when familiar systems suddenly become unreliable. She interviewed survivors of building collapses, earthquake victims, and people who had been caught in various types of catastrophic events. What she found was that heroic behavior was much more common than most people believed, but it was often unrecognized or forgotten in the aftermath of disasters. Roberto continued driving cement trucks, but he also began volunteering with Portland's emergency response training programs. He taught classes on vehicle safety during emergencies and helped develop protocols for heavy equipment operators who might encounter disaster situations.
His experience on the collapsing bridge had given him insights that were valuable to both emergency responders and civilian drivers. The Riverside Bridge was rebuilt over the course of 18 months, with improved structural design and additional safety features. The new bridge included emergency lanes and better access points for rescue vehicles, changes that had been recommended by investigators who studied the original collapse. On the day the new bridge opened to traffic, Sarah and Roberto met at the northern approach and walked across together. It was a symbolic gesture, but it felt important to both of them. They had survived something that should have killed them, and they had done so because they had chosen to trust each other and value strangers' lives as much as their own. The new bridge was undoubtedly safer than the old one, but Sarah and Roberto knew something that the engineers and safety inspectors didn't. The most important safety feature on any bridge was not the steel or concrete or engineering specifications.
It was the willingness of ordinary people to make extraordinary choices when other lives hung in the balance.
As they reached the midpoint of the new bridge, Sarah looked down at the water below and thought about Linda Morrison and her daughter Katie, about the 13 other people who had died when infrastructure failed catastrophically. Their deaths had not been meaningless, she had come to believe, because they had led to changes that would prevent similar tragedies in the future.
But that didn't make their loss any easier to bear. Roberto seemed to understand her thoughts without needing to hear them expressed.
He had carried the same weight since that October afternoon when ordinary Tuesday routines had collided with extraordinary circumstances. They would have been proud of what you did, he said quietly. Sarah nodded. Though she wasn't entirely sure that was true, she suspected that Linda Morrison would have preferred to survive the bridge collapse and watch her daughter graduate from high school, go to college, maybe get married and have children of her own.
Heroism was a poor substitute for the ordinary future that had been stolen from them. But the 37 children who had made it home safely that day were growing up with a different understanding of what people owed to each other.
Emma Rodriguez was now 13 years old and volunteering at a local food bank, driven by a conviction that helping strangers was not optional but essential. Miguel Vasquez was 11 and had convinced his parents to let him take first aid classes because he wanted to be ready to help people if something bad happened. These ripples would continue to spread outward for decades, touching lives that Sarah and Roberto would never know about. The mathematics of heroism, it turned out, were not about simple addition and subtraction.
They were about multiplication, about how single choices made in moments of crisis could echo forward through time, shaping the moral landscape of entire communities. Standing on the new Riverside Bridge, Sarah Chen realized that she had spent the last year learning the wrong lesson from her experience. She had focused on understanding decision-making during disasters, on analyzing the psychology of emergency response, and the factors that led some people to act heroically while others froze or fled.
But the real lesson was simpler and more profound. We are all more capable of extraordinary actions than we believe, and the most important choices we make are often the ones that feel impossible at the time. The 1.3 seconds of terror that had changed her life forever had lasted exactly as long as a human heartbeat. But the courage required to act during those seconds was something that could be cultivated and strengthened throughout a lifetime.
Roberto squeezed her shoulder gently as they completed their walk across the new bridge. Behind them, traffic flowed steadily in both directions, carrying people toward ordinary destinations and unremarkable Tuesday evenings.
Most of them would never face the kinds of choices that Sarah and Roberto had faced on the collapsing bridge, but some of them would, and when that moment came, Sarah hoped they would remember that heroism was not a special quality possessed by exceptional people. It was simply the willingness to stay behind when others needed you to drive toward danger instead of away from it, to choose the mathematics of human connection over the simpler arithmetic of personal survival. The new bridge would stand for decades, carrying thousands of people safely across the Willamette River. But its most important legacy was not its improved engineering or enhanced safety features. It was the knowledge that when infrastructure fails and ordinary systems break down, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things.
And that knowledge, passed from one generation to the next through stories and examples and the quiet heroism of daily choices, might be the strongest foundation of all.
1.3 seconds of terror, the moment everything hung in the balance.